Hello there, this is the video for the 1.09 lesson, Less Than Equal. As the United States celebrated its 100th birthday and then entered the 20th century, there was much to be proud of. Democracy had widened to include most white men and slavery had been abolished. But despite the nation's truly remarkable accomplishments, millions of American citizens were still banned from the promises of liberty. Southern states had replaced slavery with practices that continued to deny most blacks economic, political, and social rights. Learn how three Americans, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey worked in different ways to improve life for African Americans. Goals for this lesson: describe the effects of economic and social racism on black Americans at the turn of the 20th century. Identify Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and their achievements. Recognize the different approaches to improving life for African Americans taken by Washington, Du Bois, and Garvey. As always, don't forget to collect your lesson resources, get your reading guide and the lesson answer key, and begin the lesson reading pages 584 through 598. So let's start here. This is just the beginning of the chapter showing marches for women's suffrage, marches for equality. Will be some of the topics we'll be covering in this chapter. The road to equality. When the American people woke up on the morning of January 1st, 1900, they had much to be thankful for. Not only could they welcome a new century, they could also celebrate the nation's remarkable accomplishments. In little more than 100 years, the United States had given the world a new philosophy of government, and the Declaration of Independence, freed itself from European domination, survived a bloody civil war, and emerged as a leading industrial power. Like the Statue of Liberty, lifting her torch high above New York Harbor, the United States in 1900 was in many ways a beacon of hope and promise. But troubling problems remained. If all men are created equal, then why were millions of citizens still denied basic civil and political rights? As previous chapters have recounted, the majority population, mostly white Protestants, discriminated against various immigrant groups, sometimes on the basis of ethnicity, as in the case of Asian and Mexican immigrants, and sometimes on the basis of religion, as in the case of Catholics and Jews. Beyond this discrimination targeted at specific immigrants, however, the promise of American life also remained unrealized, though in different ways, for two larger segments of the American population, African Americans and women. African Americans faced segregation and violence. At the turn of the 20th century, there were more than 8 million African Americans in the United States. The vast majority, more than 80%, lived in the former Confederate states. Most of these men and women were sharecroppers. They rented plots of land from large landowners and paid their rent with a share, usually a third to half, of the crops they grew. While sharecropping allowed black families to stay together and work the land without overseers or gang labor, the system was grossly unfair. Sharecroppers were forced to buy all their tools, supplies, seed, food, and household items from landowners who charged inflated prices. Denied access to the account books, sharecroppers had little real knowledge of what their crops sold for. At harvest time, millions of sharecroppers discovered that, according to the landowners' accounts, they had made little money or had fallen deeper in debt. As William Pickens, the son of an Arkansas sharecropper, put it, "The white man did all the reckoning, the Negro did all the work." Jim Crow laws, segregation in the South. While sharecropping kept African Americans from making economic progress in the South, their political and social progress was hampered by other means. Shortly after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, known as the Reconstruction Amendments, had ended slavery and granted citizenship and its privileges, especially the vote, to formerly enslaved people. Most Southern states, however, found ways to get around these new laws and continued to deny African Americans their political and social rights. Here's a picture of it's captioned, "Jim Crow laws sought to segregate African Americans and deny them their basic rights." I think this looks like a storefront, I'm guessing. Okay. But in the closing decades of the 1800s, white Southerners had passed laws and implemented other measures to create a segregated society, a society in which the races are separated. Beginning in the 1870s, white-controlled Southern state legislatures passed scores of so-called Jim Crow laws. With roots in the old antebellum slave codes, these new segregation laws were supposedly designed to regulate contact between the races' day-to-day life. In reality, however, these laws aimed to separate the races, to deny African Americans their basic rights, and to keep blacks at the very bottom of Southern society. Jim Crow laws restricted Southern blacks to segregated streetcars, railroad cars, hospitals, and schools. African Americans were barred from white-only restaurants, theaters, and amusement parks. They were even forced to use separate water fountains. There were also laws that prevented blacks and whites from marrying each other and from living in the same neighborhoods. Jim Crow went beyond laws enforcing segregation to including a set of unspoken rules that every Southerner, black and white, came to know. For example, in stores, blacks had to wait for white customers to be served first. African Americans learned not to look white people in the eye, never to knock on the front door of a white person's home, and to never dispute what a white person said. Failure to comply with these unwritten social customs of Jim Crow could lead to dire consequences. Who was Jim Crow? Let's read this box here. Sorry, I have cat fur in my floating around by my face here. As far as historians can tell, the term Jim Crow came from minstrel shows in which white actors wore black face paint and performed song and dance routines. In 1828, a minstrel performer named Thomas Daddy Rice sang about a character called Jim Crow. The song became immensely popular, and whites began to use the name Jim Crow as a derogatory term for being black. Okay, I gotta get this cat out of the way. Separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1890, Louisiana lawmakers passed the Separate Car Act, a Jim Crow law requiring that blacks ride in separate railroad cars from whites. In June of 1892, Homer Plessy, who is 1/8 black, bought a first-class ticket and sat in a car for whites only. When he was ordered to move, he refused and was arrested. In the New Orleans District Court, Plessy's lawyer argued that his client's constitutional rights had been violated, since the 13th Amendment had banished slavery and the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all citizens. The judge in the case, John Howard Ferguson, disagreed and ruled the state's Separate Car Act was constitutional. Plessy appealed, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the landmark case of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the United States government gave its stamp of approval to segregation. All but one justice on the High Court agreed that segregation was legal as long as blacks had access to separate but equal facilities. Okay, there's a few Supreme Court cases that we talk about in U.S. history that are of utmost importance. Plessy versus Ferguson is one of them. Plessy versus Ferguson would stand that idea that segregation is okay until we get to the 1950s with the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. But that's coming up in a later unit, of course. But now more about Plessy versus Ferguson. The majority opinion, the written explanation of the court's decision, agreed on by most of the justices, stated that the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of the laws did not mean a guarantee of social equality. The justices agreed that while the amendment was intended to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color, or to enforce social equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to the other. The Supreme Court justices further rejected Plessy's argument that the enforced separation of the two race stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, the justices claimed, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. In reality, however, for blacks in the South, segregated facilities, be they railroad cars, public toilets, schools, or housing, were almost always inferior and unequal. The only member of the U.S. Supreme Court to dissent against the majority opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson was Justice John Marshall Harlan. A native of Kentucky, Harlan had been born into a slaveholding family but enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War. In his dissenting opinion, a written explanation of reasons why a judge or judges disagrees with the majority in the case, Harlan affirmed, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The law requires man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or his color when the civil rights as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land are involved." And the case of Plessy versus Ferguson had long-lasting results. It gave legal force to the practice of segregation. The doctrine of separate but equal set a powerful precedent that guided American legal thinking until it was finally overturned in the 1950s. Restricting voting rights. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1870, guaranteed that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But Southern whites found ways to undermine the amendment and to disenfranchise African Americans. That is, to take away their voting rights. That is what disenfranchise means, to take away voting rights. Many states impose literacy tests on voters. These tests pose questions that even an educated person probably could not answer. For example, about complex passages in a state's constitution. Because most African Americans at the time were illiterate sharecroppers or only had minimal education, they could not pass the test and so were not allowed to vote. But the tests were also too hard for many white Southerners. To avoid disenfranchising white voters, some states passed grandfather clauses, which exempted any person whose grandfather had been a registered voter from having to pass the literacy test. Since slaves had not been permitted to vote, these grandfather clauses helped whites only, because their grandfathers would not have been able to vote because they were slaves. So therefore, this grandfather clause kept many African Americans from voting. Many southern states also enacted poll taxes, which voters had to pay in order to cast ballots in local, state, and federal elections. Since most sharecroppers and tenant farmers were deeply in debt, many were disenfranchised because they could not afford to pay the poll tax. Lynching. Although mob violence had troubled Americans since colonial times, it reached a peak in the Jim Crow South. In the United States, between 1884 and 1900, there were at least 2,500 known lynchings. In a lynching, a mob, claiming to take justice in its own hands, kills a person suspected of some offense. Most victims were killed by hanging or shooting, but mobs also brutally tortured or mutilated their victims. In the West, lynch mobs terrorized some Chinese immigrants, but the vast majority of lynching victims were black men in the South, though women and children were lynched as well. Getting chills here just reading about this. Most of the victims were accused of crimes, but few were given the chance to defend themselves. Others were murdered merely for talking back to whites or for challenging the norms of Jim Crow. Lynchings were often well-organized spectacles. Newspapers sometimes advertised a lynching days in advance. Railroad companies chartered special trains to transport observers from nearby counties. Schools even dismissed students early so they could join their parents to watch a lynching. The violent savagery of these murders was meant to create terror among black Southerners and to rob black men and women of their humanity. Despite the dangers of resistance, black Southerners regularly fought back against mob violence. Ida B. Wells Barnett, a journalist originally from Mississippi, launched an international campaign against lynching. As the decades wore on, more and more black men took to arms when the threat of a lynching appeared imminent. But lacking economic or political power and without the protection of state and local governments, it was difficult for African Americans to resist Jim Crow violence. And here's a picture. In the convict lease system, state prisons lease black convicts, like this George Chain Gang, to private companies. And that's what we're going to read about next. In the South, many African American men who were sent to prison faced the horrors of the convict lease system. In this system, state penitentiaries leased inmates to private companies. The state government received much needed revenue, while the companies gained a supply of cheap labor. Most of the leased convicts were black, and many had been arrested on trumped-up petty charges. The work was little better than a death sentence. Chained together on gang, ill-fed, poorly clothed, and working under the control of armed guards, inmates dug canals, mined coal, cut down forests, drained malaria-infested swamps, and laid railroad track, often for 14 hours a day. Many died from disease, accidents, or overwork. In Alabama in 1870, the inmate death rate was 41%. As one Florida prisoner described it, this place is 9 kinds of hell. In 1893, Ida B. Wells wrote that the convict lease system and lynch laws are twin infamies which flourish hand in hand in many of the United States. Why, asked Wells, were the vast majority of convicts black? First, she said, because of religious, moral, and philanthropic forces of the country are in the hands of the Anglo-Saxon, that is, the white population. The white Christian and moral influences have not only done little to prevent the Negro from becoming a criminal, Wells charged, but they have deliberately shut him out of everything which tends to make good for citizenship. Wells further argued, the second reason our race furnishes so large a share of the convicts is that the judges, juries, and other officials of the courts are white men. They make the laws. It is wholly in their power to extend clemency to white criminals and meet severe punishment to black criminals for the same or lesser crimes. Blacks in the convict lease system, said Wells, were in effect slaves.